There's a moment, and you almost certainly know the one, where a piece of entertainment stops being entertainment and becomes an event you remember experiencing, where you can recall the room you were in, who was next to you, and the specific physical sensation of not believing what you had just watched. Those moments are rare in any medium. They are almost non-existent in television because television, for most of its existence, was engineered specifically to never produce them. And in the spring of 2011, across 10 episodes of a fantasy series that most of the industry expected to fail, one of those moments happened, and the medium that existed before it never fully came back. I want to walk through that first season not as a recap, nobody needs a recap, but as a sequence of structural decisions, because I think the interesting story isn't what happened on screen. The interesting story is what those 10 episodes did to the invisible machinery underneath all television. The economics, the assumptions, the unwritten rules about what audiences would tolerate and what stories were allowed to cost. One season, 10 hours. And a set of aftershocks we are still living inside of, some of them wonderful, and some of them, by the end of this, considerably less so. The usual caveat first, because I'd rather flag the soft spots myself than have you find them for me. This is an argument, an interpretation, and television history is messy. Some of the changes I'm going to attribute to this one season were already in motion before it aired, building for years, and this show accelerated and proved them rather than inventing them from nothing. Where that's the case, I'll say so. Take everything here as one reading of the pattern, not a court ruling. The shape is what I want you to see. So we need the ground floor first, what the television landscape actually looked like in the years before this thing premiered, because without that contrast, nothing that follows lands the way it should. By 2011, television had already had its first revolution. Prestige drama existed. The anti-hero era was in full swing, the novelistic serialized format had been proven, and the medium had earned the right to be taken seriously. But that revolution had a boundary, and the boundary was genre. The serious shows, the ones that won the awards and dominated the conversation, were realist crime families, meth cooks, ad men, cops. Fantasy, meanwhile, lived in a ghetto. It was considered inherently unserious, the domain of cheap effects, syndicated adventure shows, and niche audiences, something a network might tolerate at a low budget, but never ever bet the house on. The conventional wisdom was close to unanimous adults in the mass numbers that justify enormous budgets. Do not watch Swords and Dragons. Film could occasionally break that rule with a giant budget trilogy. Television could not, because television could not afford to. The economics simply did not exist. A single hour of TV with movie-scale production was considered financial suicide, which is why the green light itself is the first breadcrumb, before a single frame even airs. A premium network took an unfinished, sprawling, famously unadaptable series of fantasy novels, a story with dozens of point-of-view characters, multiple continents, and a plot that its own author had been unable to complete for years, and committed movie-scale money to it. The pilot went so badly it had to be substantially reshot. The industry consensus was that this was a vanity project headed for an expensive, embarrassing death. Hold on to that consensus, because everything that follows is the sound of it shattering. Now, the metaphor I want you to carry through the rest of this, because it organizes everything. Television, as a medium, had always operated on an unwritten contract with its audience. The contract had many clauses, but the load-bearing one was simple. The protagonist is safe. You may be shocked, you may be saddened, side characters may fall, but the person the story is about, the face on the poster, the name above the title, will be there next week. That clause is what made television television. It's what let you relax. Every show you had ever watched, including the prestige ones, honored it. The anti-hero shows bent it, made you fear for the lead, but they did not break it. Not like this, not in the first season, not with the person the entire narrative had been built around. And this show's first season was, from its opening minutes, a slow, deliberate burning of that contract, clause by clause, in front of a live audience. Look at how early the arson starts, because people forget this. The very first episode ends with a 10-year-old boy climbing a tower, witnessing something he shouldn't, and being pushed from the window calmly, almost gently, by one of the story's most charismatic characters, who shrugs as he does it. That is the closing image of episode 1. A child, crippled by a charming man for convenience. The show was telling you, in its first hour, exactly what it was and exactly which rules it did not intend to honor. Most viewers registered it as shock value. It wasn't. It was a notice of termination delivered politely at the start of the tenancy. But a notice is just a notice until it's enforced, And here is the second breadcrumb, the center of the entire case. The season had a protagonist, unambiguously. The most famous actor in the cast, the face of the marketing, the moral center of the story, the honorable man in a dishonorable world, the character through whom the audience learned this universe and around whom every plotline orbited. 9 episodes of investment, 9 episodes of the oldest storytelling promise there is. This is your hero, and heroes find a way. And in the 9th hour, with rescue plausible, with a deal seemingly struck, with every narrative instinct the audience had ever developed, screaming that an intervention was coming, the show walked him up the steps and cut his head off. No last-second save, no trick, no resurrection. The protagonist of the series was executed in front of his daughters, and the season simply continued without him because it had never actually been his story. It had been a story he was in. I want to sit on this longer than feels comfortable, because with 15 years of hindsight, it's easy to underrate what that moment did. The shock wasn't the death. Television had deaths. The shock was the retroactive rewriting of the contract. In one cut, every viewer understood that everything they had believed about the safety of characters, in this show and quietly in television generally, was void. And the effect on the audience was the opposite of what the old conventional wisdom predicted. The conventional wisdom said audiences need safety to stay invested, that killing the hero kills the show. Instead, investment exploded, because it turns out that stakes are only real when the contract is gone. If anyone can die, then every battle, every trial, every whispered plot matters in a way it structurally never could before. The show didn't lose its audience's trust that night. It traded a comfortable trust for a terrified one, and the terrified one was stronger. That single creative decision, honored rather than softened by the adaptation, recalibrated what stakes meant for an entire medium. Every shocking death in every series since, every showrunner who proudly declares that no one is safe is operating in the crater of that one beheading. Still not done, because the broken contract is the famous part, and the less famous parts may matter more. The third breadcrumb is money, and it might be the most consequential of all of them. That first season proved that television could carry spectacle, real, cinematic, movie-scale spectacle, and that a mass audience would show up for it on a weekly basis. Not fully in season 1, ironically. The first season was still relatively contained, famously keeping its biggest battle off-screen because the budget couldn't hold it. But the numbers season 1 generated, the audience growth, the cultural heat, unlocked everything after budgets that climbed year over year until single episodes cost what entire seasons of drama once had, productions spanning multiple countries simultaneously, effects work indistinguishable from blockbuster film. The wall between television production values and film production values, which had stood since the birth of the medium, came down, and it was this show's early success that supplied the wrecking ball. Once one series proved the model, that a program could be a blockbuster, the industry's entire ceiling moved. Every giant budget streaming spectacle you've watched since, every series that looks like a 10-hour film, exists because season 1 made the case that the money would come back. Fourth breadcrumb, and this one was already in motion before 2011, so I'll frame it honestly as an acceleration rather than an invention, the IP land rush. This was the season that proved a dense, beloved, previously unadaptable book series could be translated to television faithfully, at length, without compression, and become bigger than the books themselves. Before it, sprawling genre literature was considered film material or nothing, and film meant amputation, thousands of pages crushed into 2 hours. After it, television became the default destination for every major literary and franchise property on Earth, and the studios began strip mining their vaults accordingly. The consequences of that shift, for better and very much for worse, are the water the entire industry now swims in. And the fifth breadcrumb is the strangest one, because it isn't about the show at all. It's about us and about timing. This series arrived at the precise moment social media reached critical mass, and the collision created something television had never quite had: a genuinely global, genuinely simultaneous cultural event, week after week. The Monday conversation. The reaction videos of people filming their unsuspecting friends. The memes moving at the speed of the internet. The piracy records, year after year, which the network half-heartedly complained about and clearly understood as a metric of dominance. And with all of that came something we now take for granted. Modern spoiler culture, the elaborate social etiquette of who may discuss what and when, which this show, more than any other single property, forced the culture to invent. It was, in an era of accelerating fragmentation, Arguably the last true monoculture show, the last time it felt like everyone was watching the same thing at the same time, which is bitterly ironic given that the economic model it proved would help make sure nothing like that ever quite happened again. Hold that irony, we're coming back to it. Let me take a brief tangent before the turn, because there's a structural innovation inside Season 1 that gets overshadowed by the beheading and shouldn't. This was a season without a fixed center. It was built as a true ensemble, a dozen storylines with independent momentum, some of them never intersecting at all, unified not by a protagonist, but by a world. Television had done big casts before, but almost always with a clear sun for the other characters to orbit. Season 1 demonstrated that a mass audience could hold an entire map in its head, could follow a story structured like a history rather than like a biography, and would reward the demand rather than resent it. Every sprawling multi-thread epic that television has attempted since is drawing on that proof. And notice how elegantly the structure and the broken contract reinforce each other. A story with no single center is a story that can survive losing anyone, which is exactly what made the deaths possible, which is exactly what made the stakes real. The architecture and the audacity were the same decision seen from two angles. Okay, here's the turn, the part of the story that stops being a victory lap, and if the pattern of these essays has taught you anything, you knew it was coming. The contract burning worked because it was earned, and it was earned because it was singular. But television is an industry, and industries do not metabolize singular events as art. They metabolize them as formulas, and so the aftershocks of Season 1 arrived in 3 waves, each one a little more corrosive than the last. The first wave was imitation. The next Game of Thrones became an executive mantra, and the shock death, that once-in-a-generation contract violation, became a technique, then a trope, then a reflex. Shows began killing characters, not because their stories demanded it, but because audiences now expected the demonstration. And a demonstration is exactly what it became: hollow, predictable in its unpredictability, shock as a scheduled deliverable. The move only ever worked because it broke a promise. Once every show was breaking the promise, there was no promise left to break, and the technique died of its own success, the way successful mutations do. The second wave was economic. The blockbuster model that Season 1 unlocked triggered a spending arms race that is still running, streaming services bidding fortunes for franchise properties, betting sums on single seasons that would have funded entire networks a generation earlier, chasing the global event that this show proved was possible. And the events mostly have not come because the conditions weren't reproducible. The money was chasing the outcome while misunderstanding the cause. The phenomenon hadn't come from the dragons or the budget. It had come from years of patient, character-first storytelling that made the dragons matter. The industry bought the spectacle and skipped the patience, and the result is a landscape of enormously expensive fantasy that arrives, costs a fortune, and vanishes from the conversation in a week. And the third wave, the cruelest one, came from inside the house. Because the show that taught the world about broken contracts eventually broke its own. Years later, in its final stretch, the series that had built its empire on patience, consequence, and the credibility of its own ruthlessness rushed its ending, and the same globally synchronized audience that had made it a phenomenon turned on it in real time, with the same tools at the same speed. The backlash was itself a landmark. The first time the monoculture machine this show had assembled was pointed at the show. And the damage outlived the discourse. An entire industry watched the most valuable property in television lose an enormous share of its cultural standing in a matter of weeks, and drew a lesson about the fragility of long-form investment that has haunted serialized storytelling since. The show that proved audiences would commit to a decade-long story also supplied the cautionary tale about what happens when that commitment is betrayed. Both proofs came from the same address. So how do you weigh the legacy of those first 10 episodes? I keep arriving at 3 readings, and I don't think you're required to choose. The first is elevation. Season 1 dragged an entire genre out of the ghetto and made fantasy, the most commercially dismissed form of storytelling on television, into the medium's crown jewel. Serious actors, serious writing, serious money applied to dragons, and the culture didn't laugh, it knelt. That door does not close again. Fair reading and true. The second is economic revolution. Season 1 is the moment television and film production stopped being different classes of object, the proof that a series could be a blockbuster, with everything that unlocked and everything it costs us. This is the reading with the longest tail, because the spending it triggered is still reshaping what gets made and what doesn't right now. The third is the one I keep coming back to, A Fault Line with a Shadow. 10 episodes that permanently expanded what television stories were allowed to do, whom they were allowed to kill, what they were allowed to cost, and how much of an audience's trust they were allowed to demand, and that simultaneously seeded the imitation, the arms race, and the eventual betrayal that would tarnish the very trust it pioneered, not one and then the other, both from the same season, the way it always seems to go. Here's where I'll leave it. We now live in a television landscape where anyone can die, where a series can look like cinema, where the biggest stories on earth default to the long form, and we treat all of that as the natural order, the way you treat any inheritance you didn't personally have to earn. But it was earned at a specific moment by a specific set of decisions that the entire industry considered reckless right up until the instant they worked. The green light nobody understood. The child pushed from the window in hour 1, the hero walked up the steps in hour 9. A contract that had governed the medium for 60 years was burned in a single season, on purpose, in full view of everyone, and every show you watch tonight. The fearless ones and the hollow imitations alike is written on the ashes. That's the trail. 10 episodes, one broken promise, and a medium that decided watching the smoke rise that it preferred the fire. Take care of yourselves out there.